Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome. My name is Wendy Perdue. I'm the dean here at the University of Richmond School of Law. And on behalf of the University of Richmond and the Marriage Center for Environmental Studies, I'm delighted to welcome you to this debate. The debate is brought to you by the Robert R. Marriage Jr. Center for Environmental Studies. And this is the third presidential election in which the Marriage Center has held just such an event. The center is named in honor of U.S. District Judge Robert R. Marriage Jr. and was created in recognition of the work that he did in settling the Keepone litigation in the 1970s. Issues concerning energy and the environment affect everyone, and as a university, we are very pleased to be able to offer a venue for a serious discussion of these important policies and choices that will be affected by the presidential election. I do want to make clear that the views expressed during this event are those of the speakers and not of the University of Richmond. The University of Richmond does not endorse or oppose any candidate for public office, and the use of our facilities does not constitute an endorsement. So with that legal qualification to make sure everyone understands the ground rules, let me introduce the director of the center, Professor Noah Sachs.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Professor Noah Sachs here at the law school. I want to welcome you all. I want to welcome our students, our community members to this debate on energy and environment in the 2016 campaign. This is actually the third in a series of debates that we've had on energy and environmental issues, the first in 2008 and then again in 2012. So our two speakers today have been authorized by their respective campaigns to speak on behalf of the candidates. And the focus today is energy and environment exclusively. These are issues that are critically important for our future, but haven't received much attention in the three main presidential debates. So by way of introduction, on my right is Congressman Kevin Cramer, Republican from North Dakota. He is energy advisor to the Trump campaign, and he has served in the House since 2013 and sits on the House Energy and Commerce Committee. Congressman Cramer is a former public service commissioner for North Dakota with extensive experience with the energy industry, and also a former chairman of the Republican Party of North Dakota. And on my far right is Trevor Houser, energy advisor for the Clinton campaign. Mr. Houser is a partner with the Rhodium Group in New York, where he leads the firm's energy and environmental practice. He also co-directs the Climate Impact Lab, which is a collaboration of research institutes studying climate change. Mr. Houser worked as a senior advisor in the U.S. State Department in the first Obama administration. So the format of today will be as follows. We're going to have a formal debate for about 35 minutes, which I will moderate, and I will sometimes ask a question that goes to both speakers, in which case each will have 2 minutes to answer. And sometimes there may be a question for one speaker, in which case that person will have 2 minutes to answer, and the other person will get 1 minute to reply. And we've just agreed that Congressman Cramer will go first, and then we'll alternate from there. In the second part of this event, we're going to have audience questions. We have a mic right there in the aisle. And so at that point, people can line up to ask questions. And you can ask questions of both speakers or one speaker. We're not going to put time limits on these questions, but I just ask you to be brief. And I ask for your answers to be brief. And the first 4 questions tonight, I'm going to reserve for you of our students to ask questions first. I'm only going to accept questions that are about energy and environmental topics. And if the questions get a little repetitive, I may just ask that we move on to a new topic from the audience. Without further ado, the first question for both of you, and this will go to Congressman Cramer first, is why is your candidate's energy and environmental policy better than your opponent's? And how will your candidate's energy and environmental policies encourage job growth?
Yeah, great. Thank you for that very general question. And thank you for the invitation and for your interest in being here. So my candidate, Donald Trump, I believe takes a much more balanced approach to energy and environmental policy. For example, we know this year we are on pace to set a record of regulatory overreach. My term, we're on a clear record to set a record of the most regulations ever imposed by the federal government on business. Regulations today are costing about $2 trillion a year to our economy. The irony of it is that on the environmental regulatory side is the regulations that are intended to meet the goal of the Clean Power Plan, for example, or our obligations under the Paris Climate Accord, don't even begin to solve the challenge of climate change. And so we're willing to unilaterally disarm our own economy to accomplish nothing globally. And that's a pretty big problem for a country that has a $19.5 trillion debt and the lowest workforce participation rate in many, many decades. So Donald Trump would take a much more balanced approach, roll back regulations that need rolling back, a complete review of all of the regulations to determine which ones meet the goals of the regulatory agencies. In the case of the EPA, for example, his goal is to get the EPA back to its core mission of clean water and clean air and impose rational regulations based on rational problems and put America back to work. Also to get regulations out of the marketplace. In other words, to allow markets to choose, for example, in the energy world, the fuel resource that's most appropriate to the market, whether it be coal, clean coal. He always talks about clean coal. We can get more into that later if you'd like. Oil, gas, wind, solar, biofuels, whatever the energy source might be, to have a more neutral, if you will, policy.
Okay, thank you. And Mr. Houser?
Great. Thanks to you all for coming out today and giving us a chance to talk about these issues, which didn't come up in the debate. For the students here, I'm sorry that you all didn't get a chance to take legal ethics with Senator Kane when he was a professor here. I'm sure it was fantastic. I wish I could have taken it. So it's a great opportunity to talk about these issues. There are obviously a lot of contrast between Donald Trump and Secretary Clinton, and their approach to energy and environmental issues is pretty high among those lists. So we have a candidate in Donald Trump who believes that climate change is a hoax created by the Chinese, who has a history of opposing renewable energy despite the fact that it's the fastest growing source of job creation in the country, who has a strange obsession with the Montreal Protocol because he blames it for making his hairspray less effective, and who has false promises for America's coal communities, for oil and gas communities, that fossil fuel production can be an engine of the American economy for the next century, and that we can wish away climate change. Secretary Clinton believes that climate change is a serious threat, not only to the health of our families and our communities, but also to our economy. And she believes that we have what it takes to meet that challenge. We're a country with a proud tradition of standing tall in the face of big challenges, of digging deep and pulling together and meeting those challenges, and that's what we need to do here, and she believes that Americans absolutely have what it takes to do that. Over the past 7 years, wind energy has grown threefold in the US, solar power has grown 30-fold. Electricity prices are lower now than they were 7 years ago. We're making the most advanced cars and trucks, fuel-efficient cars and trucks in the world, saving drivers billions of dollars. And this year, Chevy's going to roll out its first mass-market electric vehicle, so fewer Americans will have to fill up at the pump at all. And we're just getting started. There's a lot that we can do together if we acknowledge the science, pull together, dig deep, and get it done.
Thank you. All right, the next question will go to Mr. Houser first. So 2015 was the hottest year on record, and 2016 is about to outpace that. The top 10 hottest years on record have all occurred since '98. And at the same time, cities like Miami and Norfolk, Virginia are threatened by sea level rise. And so first, do you believe that greenhouse gas emissions from human activities are the cause of the warming we're seeing? And second, whatever the cause, what do you think the government should be doing now to adapt to these changes, especially with temperature and sea level rise?
Great, thanks for the question. I mean, look, it's the verdict's pretty clear. Anthropogenic greenhouse gas emissions, which are those from fossil fuel combustion and other human activity, are driving the acceleration in temperatures that we've seen. 15 of the 16 hottest years on record have occurred since 2000, and like you said, 2016 shaping up to be another record buster. And unless we act, it's going to get worse. We've already seen record droughts in the west, record flooding in the east. Here in Virginia, if we don't act by the time law students here today retire, the number of days above 95 degrees each year is going to more than quadruple. The Hampton Roads area is the second largest population center in the country threatened by sea level rise after New Orleans. And sea level rise near Hampton's Roads is already 15, 16 inches above pre-industrial levels. And by 2030, there's $17 billion worth of Virginia property that's at risk of being below high tide unless we act. So we need to do two things. We need to reduce emissions here in the US and in collaboration with countries around the world. And that's what the Paris Agreement puts us on track to do. The first truly global climate agreement with 195 countries, emission reduction commitments from countries accounting for more than 95% of global emissions. But then we also need to invest in resilience to protect our communities from the climate change that we can't avoid, including sea level rise that's already baked in, temperature increases that are going to occur no matter what, to make our families and our communities more resilient to that change.
Thank you. Congressman?
Well, I come from North Dakota. Fargo, North Dakota, the area that I grew up in is called the lake bed of Lake Agassiz, a glacial lake bed that was created thousands of years, if not millions of years ago by glaciers. I think it'd be a bit, we'd have to be a bit proud to think that somehow these last hot years are the fault of man and not some larger regular cycle of climate. That said, I don't know what the temperature is going to be tomorrow, much less how many days are going to be above 95 degrees in a few years. Hillary Clinton has a plan to spend $200 billion tax dollars. The long list of things that Trevor talked about to create jobs all cost tax dollars. You can create all kinds of jobs if you want to throw tax dollars at something and say you have to do this and here's the money to do it with. But that doesn't get our economy going again. The Paris Accord allows China, imagine this, China, who is responsible for 30% of the global emissions this year, and the United States, which is responsible for 15%, half of China's, allows them to continue growing their emissions until 2030 while the U.S. continues to reduce its. In other words, again, another unilateral disarmament of our economy to solve a global problem. Now, why is it always on the United States to take care of every global problem if in fact there is one? 70% of the coal jobs in Virginia have been lost. Virginia is a major fracking and natural gas producing country, or state. Even though Senator Kane said as recently as August of this year, Virginia doesn't do any fracking. I mean, I don't know where he's been for the last several years, but that's the case. But that's just the tip of the iceberg, if you excuse the expression. If you're going to meet the Paris Climate Accord, 80% reduction by 2050, for example, it's not going to be done with closing every coal-fired power plant and every natural gas power plant. You're going to have to get to manufacturing. And China is a communist country that subsidizes trade-sensitive industries like cement and steel and aluminum, which are also large energy users.
Time is up. All right, the next question is for you, Congressman Cramer, about Mr. Trump. And that is that Mr. Trump throughout this year has called for eliminating the EPA as a federal agency. And last year he said that what the EPA does is a disgrace. So how can voters be confident that Mr. Trump would protect our air and water if he wants to eliminate this agency, which is the agency that implements the federal statutes on clean air and clean water?
Well, what Mr. Trump has said, and what he said most recently in official policy position is that he'd take a hard look at all of the agencies, including the EPA, and then he wants to get the EPA back to its core mission of clean water, clean air. Now, he's also said he wants to look at, and I applaud this, these major, broad policies called the Clean Air Act and the Clean Water Act. These are very broad authorities passed by Congress decades ago in both cases that have never been updated. And the problem with it is that when we pass, and this is, by the way, on Congress as much as anything, at least recent or past Congresses, we pass these broad authorities and then leave the rulemaking up to the bureaucracy. And then this bureaucracy creates all these rules as time goes, and the courts are they're faced with these difficult decisions when they're challenged with, well, they're the technical experts, they ought to know. Congress should have been more definitive in their description or in their definitions of things. I applaud looking at things like the Clean Air Act and the Clean Water Act and looking at more prescriptive legislation. It has become very clear that the three co-equal branches of government are fast becoming unequal. And one of the reasons is that Congress has acquiesced much of its authority to the bureaucracy by passing these broad authorities and leaving it up to the bureaucracy to fashion the rules around it. And those of you studying administrative law, you know exactly what I'm talking about. And I think it's as important for Congress when they pass an authorizing piece of legislation that they define what an agency can do very specifically, and probably as important to define what it shouldn't do. Waters of the U.S. is probably the most classic example, although the Clean Power Plan is a pretty good example as well. But the Waters of the U.S. is a classic example of an agency redefining what Congress intended in an environmental law.
To the Congressman's...
1 minute to reply.
In the Congressman's defense, I think that Donald Trump said that he wanted to destroy the Department of Environmental Protection, not the EPA, whatever the Department of Environmental Protection is. Look, so first, in response to the Congressman's attack on the Paris Agreement, part of China's INDC, their commitment under that agreement, was to have 800 to 1,000 gigawatts of zero-emitting generation installed by 2030. So that's nuclear and renewables, right? Total U.S. power capacity is 1,000 gigawatts. So unless they're going to throw one hell of an overnight party 14 years from now and build 1,000 gigawatts overnight, the notion that their commitment allows them to avoid doing anything for the next 14 years is just fanciful. More importantly, you heard the Congressman list this long litany of critique of overregulation, and we hear that about President Obama's Clean Power Plan. We've heard that about every major environmental policy since the EPA was created in 1970. Every time environmental regulators look at addressing a pollutant that is impacting human health, we hear from industry that it's going to turn the lights out, that the economy is going to crater, that it's going to cost thousands of jobs, and every time that's not the case.
All right, and a question for you, Mr. Houser, about Secretary Clinton. The Obama administration continues to support oil drilling off Alaska and in the Gulf of Mexico. It has sped up the process for leasing for oil drilling on federal lands. And given the Deepwater Horizon spill in 2010, and given Secretary Clinton's commitment to reducing greenhouse gas emissions, why is she not in agreement with those environmental groups who say that we need to stop all new oil drilling, we need to leave it in the ground, including in the Gulf of Mexico?
So Secretary Clinton believes that that offshore oil production in the Arctic Ocean, the Atlantic Ocean, coast off of Virginia is not worth the risk, given that we're awash in onshore domestic oil supply right now, that we're laying down rigs in the Bakken and everywhere else, that it's not worth threatening the $14 billion outdoor economy here in Virginia, much of which relies on coastal tourism, and that we need to reform our leasing program for onshore oil and gas production as well. American taxpayers currently get 12.5% royalty for onshore oil and gas production. State lands in North Dakota, they charge 18.75% royalty. Texas charges 25% royalty. So even on the oil and gas acreage that's currently producing, taxpayers aren't getting their fair share, and that's something that needs to change.
Congressman?
Well, one of the things that Mr. Trump understands very well is that the taxpayers of this country own about $50 trillion worth of oil and gas under both offshore and under federal lands. He wants to make that more available for production. Now, the market will decide. A company can decide what's the most expensive or least expensive, what's the most efficient, what's the most effective place, where's the most effective place to drill and to mine. But the reality is that the environmental footprint of modern extraction of fossil fuels is such that, like take a place like North Dakota, one drill pad can drill multiple wells, 2 miles down, 1, 2, 3 miles out at various levels, at various degrees, various directions, and has very minimal environmental footprint. And that ought to be made available. When you have a $20 trillion debt, having $50 trillion of wealth creation not even available to the taxpayer, it makes no sense, both from an economic standpoint, job standpoint, as well as a budgetary standpoint.
A question for both of you, and Congressman Cramer, this will go to you first. The American Society of Civil Engineers issues an annual report card on American infrastructure, and in 2013 it gave the nation's water infrastructure a D grade. It estimated that $1 trillion is needed to upgrade the sewers and our drinking water systems by 2030. And as the lead poisoning in Flint, Michigan demonstrated, when we have antiquated water systems, there's a real threat to public health. So the question is, where should this money come from to upgrade our sewers and drinking water? Is this a federal or a state or a local responsibility? And more broadly, what policies should be in place to protect drinking water?
Well, that's a great question, and this is a little bit outside my realm. However, it's obviously something we as a Congress have been dealing a lot with lately, especially as it relates in the context of the Flint situation. And the answer to, is this a federal, state, or local problem? Yes, it is. It's all of those things, and I think there's a role for all of them. In fact, one of the things coming from a rural state, and both Trevor and I come from very rural places, we understand that if you're going to have that kind of safe drinking water infrastructure, there's going to be a federal role, at least in providing expertise and technical support. But by and large, it is a state and a local responsibility. I mean, look at Flint. Flint was a failure at every level of government. And so I think it's clear that all of us have to be in it together. But you're also talking about a whole bunch of money, and we're not going to solve it with a Washington solution, and you probably aren't going to solve it with a municipal solution. It's going to require everybody sitting down. But I do think there's a responsibility to the greater good by the aggregate generosity of the American taxpayer. But again, we have approaching a $20 trillion debt, and we've got to be very creative by how we do these things. But it can be done. It can be done not just with grants, but with other types of financing, for example, loan guarantee programs that are very common, that actually benefit the taxpayer because they often pay back very, very nicely.
Yeah, I mean, look, Flint was a wake-up call, and the water there is still not safe to drink. And Flint is not the only city that's suffering from lead-contaminated water. And this is, the availability of clean, safe drinking water is a basic human right, and one that we need to ensure is available to all of our citizens. And Secretary Clinton's called for eliminating lead as a public health threat within 5 years, and it's a core part of her overall infrastructure package. We'll be modernizing our drinking water and our wastewater systems, because it's unacceptable for children, and particularly children in low-income communities and communities of color, to be drinking water that's contaminated in the way that the children in Flint have.
And what about the funding issue?
I'm sure that's a negotiation that the Secretary will have with Congressman Cramer and his colleagues once she is elected. But you have bipartisan agreement on the need for infrastructure investment, on its value in accelerating economic growth, and I would hope that making the investments necessary to ensure safe drinking water is something we can find bipartisan compromise on.
And I might even add, because I think Trevor's exactly right on this, if I might. There are some wonderful technologies that can make existing infrastructure safe, but we all have to sort of sit down at the table and I think have a serious discussion, as we're having right now, on how to best do that and how to best fund it.
All right, the next question is for you, Congressman Cramer, about Mr. Trump, and that is that he has said repeatedly that he wants to cancel the 2015 Paris Climate Change Agreement, which will enter into force next week globally. So how specifically would he go about canceling that agreement? And more broadly, what kind of international negotiating strategy would a Trump administration take with respect to climate change?
Sure. Important question, because he has stated that. I'm rather certain he's committed to exactly that, because the acquiescence of America's interest to global interest has been going on way too long. And the Paris Climate Accord is one more bad trade deal. And frankly, and you're all, most of you are law students, a basic read of the Constitution would tell you that the President of the United States isn't allowed to obligate the country to these kinds of things. And a couple of weeks ago, he declared it enforceable because the European Union ratified it. Well, this little thing in the Constitution says no, the United States Senate ratifies large global commitments called treaties. Just last week, I think it was, Gina McCarthy obligated the United States with 200 other countries to a hydrofluorocarbon agreement, and just by proclamation. And this is the bigger problem. I mean, yes, there's the environmental issues and the economic issues, but there's this fundamental issue of a president unilaterally signing treaties and obligating the United States to things. The way he'd get out of it, he could do it a couple of ways. One way he could attempt is to simply step away from the accord and just announce we're not going to fulfill our obligation under it. That could be somewhat problematic, but perhaps the better way, and perhaps the more definitive way, would be to call for a ratification vote in the United States Senate, which would not pass. And that would send a very clear signal to not just to the global partners, but to the people of the United States that our Constitution still is intact, and that whatever you think about the agreement itself, his authority to obligate the nation to it is really not his to do unilaterally.
So a couple things on that. First, the authority that the United States had to negotiate the Paris Agreement came from the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change that was signed by Republican President George H.W. Bush and was ratified by the U.S. Congress. The Paris Agreement does not legally bind us to meet our 26 to 28% emission reduction commitments. The treaty obligations under the Paris Agreement are to report to the international community on the progress that we're making. It's a politically binding agreement. But even more importantly, if Donald Trump actually believed that climate change was an issue that needed to be addressed, then maybe we'd be a little more interested in his views on the most successful international negotiating strategy. But this posture of climate change isn't real, but if it was real, this would be a better deal, is just a complete non-starter. And I think the same goes for conversations with climate deniers in Congress, Congressman. We look forward to having willing partners on the other side of the aisle who acknowledge the science and are willing to engage in a constructive conversation about how to solve it. But when the conversation stops at we are ignoring 97% of the scientific community and don't believe that climate change is man-made, it's very difficult to have that conversation.
Okay, the next question is for Mr. Houser about Secretary Clinton. In a primary debate last March, she said that she wants more regulation of hydraulic fracturing or fracking for natural gas drilling. She said, by the time we get through with all my conditions, I don't think there will be many places in America where fracking will continue to take place. So why then did she support fracking as Secretary of State and promoted it in other countries, including Poland and China and elsewhere?
So Secretary Clinton's view is that natural gas has an important role to play in the transition to a clean energy economy and the fight against climate change if the right safeguards are in place. There are environmental consequences of all oil and gas production, including that from hydraulic fracturing, that are not currently being addressed. Methane emissions, which are a potent greenhouse gas. We need to have standards to reduce methane leaks from both new and existing sources of oil and gas production, and from outdated distribution gas pipeline systems that create a safety risk as well. It's important that EPA have the authority that Congress originally gave it under the Safe Drinking Water Act to ensure that well casings done for hydraulic fracturing don't present any risk to local water supply. And then third, wastewater injection from hydraulic fracturing is increasing seismic events in Oklahoma and Texas and other places. We just recently had a 5.1 earthquake in Oklahoma tied to wastewater injection, and it's important that standards are in place to prevent that from occurring. So
based on the previous question, it's always easy to debate somebody if the first condition is you have to agree with their premise. There's many things he just said that just fundamentally aren't true, like wastewater injection is affecting, for example, drinking water. That's never happened in fracking. Never has happened. By the way, remember, her running mate, Tim Kaine, who should have some familiarity with Virginia, doesn't even know that you frack here, and he's an elected official. She also said that this transition that Trevor talks about to a renewable fuel electric generation, 100%, but we need to cross that bridge very fast. Natural gas is the bridge, but we want to cross it very quickly. Who is going to invest in natural gas generation, natural gas production, natural gas transportation, pipelines, and all the things to build an infrastructure for natural gas electric generation if we're going to cross the bridge too quickly to pay for it? With regard to methane emissions, there are more methane emissions coming from wetlands than there are from fossil fuel energy in this country. Are we going to now get rid of all the wetlands?
All right. This next question is for both of you. And Mr. Houser, you'll go first on this. There's so much focus when we talk about energy policy in the U.S. about the connections between energy policy and climate change. But what about conventional air pollution? There was a 2013 study by MIT researchers that estimated there are 200,000 premature deaths each year in the U.S. Due to air pollution. So what would your candidate do to reduce conventional air pollution from things like cars and trucks and factories and power plants?
So the nice thing is we can tackle a lot of the conventional pollutants as we tackle carbon pollution together. So the Clean Power Plan, for example, would reduce, by reducing sulfur dioxide emissions, mercury, particulate matter, would prevent 3,600 premature deaths each year, 90,000 asthma attacks, prevent 300,000 missed school and work days, fuel economy standards for cars and light trucks that are coming up for review next year. By reducing the amount of oil consumed for each mile driven, are reducing sulfur dioxide, NOx, as well as carbon pollution. So we need to think about all these air pollutants together as we put in place the right safeguards.
And herein lies Mr. Trump's fundamental environmental policy, where he has said we need to deal with the rational issues, the fundamental core policies or responsibilities of the EPA, clean air and clean water. Trevor talks about SOx, NOx, mercury, particulate matter reductions. Those have been happening not because the EPA requires them to, but rather because the environmental community and the business community has worked together to identify the challenges and then create the investments and the technology that solves the problem. The Clean Power Plan is the very definition, law students, of arbitrary and capricious. They have chosen arbitrary standards that are unmeetable with today's technology, designed to kill an industry that would be the very industry that would invest in the solution. That can happen even with CO2 emissions. But that's not the goal of this administration, nor is it the goal of Secretary Clinton. Her goal is to, remember, put all of the, or at least many of the coal miners out of business. So far, so good. Very successful.
Let me just, one point on this. So as an example of the scare tactics that are always used on sensible environmental policy. So the Congressman just said that the Clean Power Plan's targets are unattainable. The Clean Power Plan calls for a 32% reduction in power sector CO2 emissions below 2005 levels by 2030. The first 6 months of this year, we were at 27%. So we're 84% of the way there with 14 years left to go. I think that's something that the American people have the ability to do, to close that gap from 27% to 32%.
It is impossible in places like Wyoming and North Dakota. So in North Dakota, the proposed rule was 11% reduction in CO2 emissions. The day they changed from a proposed rule to a final rule, it was a 45% reduction. That's called arbitrary and capricious, students. It's called bait and switch for those of you that like the slang of regulatory law. But it's designed to do one thing: put all the coal miners out of business, necessarily cause electrical rates to skyrocket, to quote the current president, bankrupt coal companies, to quote the current president. If the solution is a reduced CO2 future, we can do that if you bring the industries to the table. There are technologies being developed that can get there, but the goal should be to reduce emissions, not to kill certain parts of the industry.
Okay, we're out of time. Thank you. At this point, we will open up the mic for audience questions. As I said, the first 4 questions should come from you of our students.
Thank you both for being here. Something that's missing from the discourse around climate change is animal agriculture. I have a few statistics. According to the UN, livestock is responsible for 65% of human-related emissions of nitrous oxide. Also, according to World Watch, animal agriculture is responsible for 18% of emissions of climate change, including carbon dioxide. Those are low estimates. Now, to have clean air and clean water, we need to do something about factory farming and the animal agricultural industry. How do both of your candidates intend on addressing these problems?
Well, Congressman Kramer comes from the agricultural sector. So.
Well, I do, and first of all, just so you all know right up front, once again he brought up global interests trying to deal with, and we're trying to deal with American issues. And this is at the rub of this whole campaign, this whole election is, are we going to continue to acquiesce American interests to global interests? We're not going to put diapers on cattle, nor are we going to stop eating beef. I mean, animal agriculture is not just an important part of our economy, but it's what we choose to do as consumers. We choose to both grow these critters and the food that feeds them and to consume them. But we're not, there are a lot of other issues, by the way. How about manufacturing? China manufactures 50% of the output of cement in the world, 60% of the steel in the world. The United States does 2 and 5% of those two industries. So, you know, we've got lots of things to tackle if we're going to get to the goals of the Global Climate Accord.
So it's a great question. I think that this is, you know, there's a lot of areas where we have a pretty good sense of what the solutions look like the electric power sector. We have lots of different options. Renewables are getting cheaper every year. For agricultural related greenhouse gas emissions, there's some interesting work going on at the lab level in universities on alternative feedstocks for livestock and grazing practices, but I think that's an area where we need to do a lot more research because the stats you cite mention, tackling the climate challenge is going to go beyond the electric power sector. There's lots of other sources of gases that we have to look at.
Next question.
Good afternoon. The Chesapeake Bay is an incredibly important natural resource, not just for the economy, but also due to its biological diversity and its uniqueness. Not long ago, the long-term health of the bay was in serious doubt due to pollution coming from agriculture and other sources. In 2009, President Obama issued an executive order in which he directed the federal government to lead a renewed effort to protect and restore the bay. And in 2010, the EPA issued numeric pollution limits. The states are in the process of carrying out plans to ensure that those limits are achieved. Would you advise your candidates to carry on President Obama's efforts to protect the bay? And what if this means mandatory limits on the agricultural industry?
Mr. Houser, you want to take that first?
Yeah, it's a little outside of my wheelhouse, so we certainly support President Obama's efforts to protect Chesapeake Bay. In terms of the specific state mechanisms, I'm a little outside of my field of depth, unfortunately.
You know what I would say on behalf of Mr. Trump, again, this is where he's been very clear. This is where he's been, when I say this, I'm talking about rational, you know, core responsibilities of the federal government with regard to environmental protection, clean air and clean water. The nice thing is, and I know Trevor knows this, even though it's not in either one of our wheelhouses, that agriculture can adjust, and there's a lot of benefit to agriculture oftentimes in adjusting, and we're finding new techniques such as minimum tilling to no tilling, you know, cover crop during the non-production part of the seasons, doing more things with less chemicals, finding the right chemicals. All of those are solutions that can find, and I think Chesapeake Bay is evidence that can happen. In fact, it's evidence to the resiliency of much of our nature when we make those quick changes. So I don't think you'd have any trouble with President Trump with regard to clean water.
Hello, thank you guys for coming today. I just had a quick question, more on like a broad scale. Could you just briefly address what your candidate's position is on the role of nuclear power in the American energy infrastructure?
Wow, that's great.
Yeah, so look, Secretary Clinton's view is that climate change is too important an issue to take any technology solution off the table. Nuclear provides more than 60% of all our zero carbon generation today. And so those existing plants that are safe to operate and that are commercial to operate, if you value the climate benefit into their operation, should continue to operate. And that we need to invest in advanced nuclear power, fourth generation reactors, so that we have those options available. Whether it's renewables, efficiency, biofuels, advanced nuclear, carbon capture and sequestration, we need every tool available in this fight. We can't be doing it with one hand tied behind our back.
Mr. Trump has been very clear that he wants an America first, all the above energy policy, which takes nothing off of the table. That means the fossils, but as well as solar, as biomass, wind, as we've talked about, and nuclear. Nuclear to me is a very exciting opportunity because it is emissions free, and it also provides the opportunity to do more, sort of location, less centralized generation, which is easier for distribution and transmission and all of those things. And there's some exciting technologies. We as a country, as a Department of Energy, that's one area, by the way, the Department of Energy actually does have a lot of oversight. That we have oversight of and some exciting opportunities for. And all of these things need to be on the table, absolutely. And you'll have, again, no trouble with the President Trump with advancing nuclear. Trevor and I were just in San Diego. I should have taken you with me. I went on a tour we have a DOE fusion lab that General Atomics owns there, where a lot of students, you maybe have even been there since you've been in California for a bit, right? It's very cool to see what students, not just from the United States, but from around the world, and researchers and developers have had access to. And then they also have a fission lab, which is another, talk about a global issue. It's a little nerdy even for me, frankly. But it's pretty cool.
We can always hope.
Yeah, you can always hope.
Good afternoon.
Hi.
My question is for Congressman Cramer. Your previous answer to this question left me with a tone of perhaps a bit of agnosticism. So I'd like to just get this rather clear. Do you affirm or deny the existence of anthropogenic climate change?
I think it's grossly exaggerated. That's my personal view. But here's the bigger problem for me. I think the vast majority of Americans are neither climate deniers nor climate worshipers, and that's unfortunately where the political discourse is. I mean, the idea that that we're going to somehow outlaw cattle, for example, is what some people's idea of dealing with climate change. And so somewhere in between, I think the vast majority of Americans want a reduction in CO2 emissions. I think there's plenty of room for compromise, technological advancement, discussion about how to do that. And by the way, I don't think there's anybody that thinks fewer emissions is a bad idea, because a lot of these technologies lead to other types of pollution controls. So we can go that route, but I don't share in this alarmism. I believe that the world is way older than we give it credit for, and it's a lot more dynamic than we know about. And that's why I say, glacial lakes turned into valleys of rich food production thousands and millions of years ago, and I suspect that the day will come again, and it won't have anything to do with what we do.
Can I just say, I don't know how the Republican Party got to this point. I went back, we had a platform process this summer in the Republican Party and the Democratic Party, and I went back to the 2008 Democratic and Republican Party platforms just as a reference point. And I had to reread the Republican Party platform 3 times to make sure I was reading the right party's platform. Had a whole section on climate change. The standard bearer that year, John McCain, said that tackling climate change would be one of his top 3 priorities. He proposed a cap and trade system. By 2012, all mention of climate change had been stripped from the Republican Party platform. And if you read this year's Republican Party platform, it is a line-by-line attack on our bedrock environmental laws, most of which were enacted by Republican presidents. If Donald Trump is elected president, he will be the only leader out of 195 leaders around the world who doesn't believe in climate change. And it just makes it very difficult to come up with solutions if you don't even acknowledge the premise of the problem.
But here's the issue, though. Here's the problem, though. Why is it that the 194 other countries rely on us to always go along with all of them? Therein lies, again, the rub of this entire debate in this entire election, not just on global climate change, but on the whole thing. It's like we're the hinge-pin to everything, and this is what the people of the country are frustrated with. This is probably why John McCain isn't the president today, because we're tired of acquiescing our interests to global interests. If the United States ceased to exist tomorrow, ceased to exist, No more power plants, no more automobiles, no more factories, no more flagellating cattle. We wouldn't affect the temperature in the next 50 years on the globe. So why are we having this political fight over something that's frankly been blown way out of proportion when we can have a serious discussion about the core principles and the core responsibilities of environmental protection?
It's just the problem is this notion that the United States is the only one acting and deploying clean energy or reducing emissions is just outdated information. So last year, China added more renewable energy than the US and Europe combined. Coal consumption in China has declined in absolute terms for the past 2 years running. Right? We're no longer in a conversation with other countries where it's the US and other developed countries doing all the work and developing countries getting a free ride. That was a conversation 2 decades ago. We're at a much different point. The choice we face now is, are we left behind? Some country is going to be the clean energy superpower of the 21st century. Either it's going to be China, it's going to be Germany, it's going to be us. And Secretary Clinton wants to ensure that it's us, wants to ensure that we're not ceding the $13.5 trillion of clean energy investment unlocked by the Paris Agreement to other countries.
So while China continues to build coal-fired power plants, albeit at a slower rate than they were before, while we close them, that is not equal. That's them going this way and that's us going this way. And you can sort of fashion it in some sort of complicated model, but the reality is they get to increase till 2030 while we decrease at the same time. And these other trade-sensitive products that they create, and they're already whooping us at, steel. I mean, they flooded our market with steel and shut down our steel industry already in the last few years. They subsidize, they're communists, they subsidize trade-sensitive products. And we're not going to compete in that type of a global market.
We have another question.
I have a question for Representative Cramer. He's talked about ice ages and the cooling of the planet and the warming of the planet. Of course, you didn't personally observe that. You believe that to be true because scientists have told us that that happened in years past. The overwhelming majority of these same brilliant scientists are telling us that people are causing global climate change. So how can you balance one against the other?
Okay, let's do this. How about I just give you that? Let's just say it's all true. Let's talk about the solution. If the solution is the United States of America ceases to exist again, or we who are responsible for 15% of the global emissions of CO2 and going down, by the way. By the way, we've been reducing our CO2 emissions consistently. And speaking of animal agriculture, we're emitters of CO2 as well. So if we're going to talk about a realistic solution, why is it again that the United States of America is somehow the whole thing depends on us doing it? Rather than if it's such a great idea, why wouldn't the 194 other countries be dying to do it with or without us, to become the leader in this new economy? Because it's an economy that is designed by the government as opposed to a market. Let the innovators innovate. We can solve emissions reduction with the industries that I'm talking about, not by getting rid of them.
A response?
Yeah, I mean, again, it's just outdated information. News today, globally, renewable capacity just exceeded coal capacity. Coal consumption is actually falling, Congressman, in China. Past 2 years, it's fallen in absolute terms. Emissions are declining in China for the first time now in more than 2 decades, right? Other countries are acting. And this notion that, I mean, this is the thing that really troubles me, is that Donald Trump and other Republicans either they kind of pivot from, and we just saw that from, if you don't like my climate denier answer, here's my kind of defeatist answer of we just don't have what it takes, that it's too hard, that why should we do it if the rest of the world isn't going to do it? That just seems so out of sync to me with who we are as a country. That's not the way we responded to fascism in Europe. That's not the way we dealt with expansion of the interstate highway system. That's not the way we dealt with cracking, splitting the atom or mapping the genome. Like, we take on hard challenges and we don't sit there, with mapping the genome, we didn't sit there thinking like, oh, well, if nobody else is working hard to map the genome, why shouldn't we do it? We take on those challenges and we should do that here as well.
And so Hillary Clinton and Barack Obama thinks climate change is collectively the greatest tragedy and the greatest issue, the biggest challenge facing us, while we have terrorists lopping off people's heads around the country and around the globe as well as in our own country. And we can only tackle so many things at one time. If it's such a great idea, I'm not saying we should do it because even though no one else does it. I'm saying if it's such a great idea, why is everybody else dependent on us to do it? That's my question. Why is it the other 95 or 85% of the emissions in the world somehow dependent on us doing it first, or they can't do it without us?
Next question.
Sorry, Mr. Houser, I have another one for Congressman Cramer. I think it's historically clear that the private companies on the market do not always act in the interest of public health. With that in mind, how...
I'm sorry, I didn't hear
Can you pull the mic a little closer to your
the premise of your question.
Can I think it is historically clear that private companies on the market do not always act in the interest of public health. With that in mind, how is it responsible to allow these companies to establish independently what energy sources we should be using in the future?
I don't think they should do it independently. I'm saying they should be at the table. And that's the difference with the Clean Power Plan and every other challenge, environmental challenge we've taken on. I come from a coal-producing state. Everybody thinks of North Dakota as raising wheat and oil, but we've been producing coal for 40, 50 years and generating it right at the mine mouth and distributing that electricity throughout the Midwest. And we have some of the lowest electrical rates in the country, which makes us very competitive for all kinds of other activity. So I'm not saying that I'm not saying that the way you framed it. What I'm saying is they should be at the table. They were at the table when Sachs was a problem. They were at the table when NOx was a problem, when mercury was a problem. They were at the table when particulate matter was a problem. They've invested hundreds of millions of dollars per plant just in the last few years to meet environmental standards. North Dakota is one of 7 states or so that meet all the ambient air quality standards as prescribed by the EPA, because our companies are at the table investing in research and development, working with the University of North Dakota and the Energy and Environmental Research Center to find solutions. So I'm not saying that they would do it independently. I'm saying they've got to be at the table, as opposed to just, when the public policy is we're going to put you out of business, that's not a good public policy.
So they were at the table in the development of the Clean Power Plan, and one of the things that a number of utilities asked for was a trading system that would allow them to choose geographically where to reduce emissions, right? So if you didn't want to get the emission reductions in North Dakota, you could get emission reductions in other part of the WEC, the Western Grid, and credit those back towards your state target. There were a number of other things that EPA listened to through that process from industry and incorporated in the final rule. There was an extensive notice and comment period, millions of comments received, and lots of changes in the final rule from the draft to reflect that input, not just from industry groups, but environmental stakeholders, local community groups.
Did I mention 11% in the proposed rule reduction to 45%? That's the input they received, yeah. Oh no, 11% won't shut down the coal industry in North Dakota. Let's make it 45, that'll do it. And by the way, let's do it without public comment. Let's do it after it's closed, then we'll announce that we've decided. That's not inclusion. That's not including state stakeholders or industry stakeholders.
Next question.
Thank you, gentlemen, for being here. My question centers on the Dakota Access Pipeline. How do both of your candidates respond to the claims of Native American tribes that the pipeline not only endangers their water supply, but also intrudes on sacred lands?
Do you want to go for
your district?
Both? Yeah, it is my district. I'm very familiar with the Dakota. I just walked the Dakota Access Pipeline route last week with the chairman of the Standing Rock Sioux Tribe, Dave Archambault, with the commander of the Omaha District of the Corps of Engineers, which issued the permit, and then the president and the Department of Justice retracted the permit, and I suspect they're going to get it back one of these days. But first of all, my candidate hasn't commented on it, nor has Trevor's, by the way. So that's just as well as far as we're concerned. Frankly, this is a state issue, in my mind, not a federal issue. The only federal nexus, frankly, is the crossing of the Missouri River. And that was confirmed last week when we walked the private part of the pipeline by the Corps of Engineers. There's no wetlands. They couldn't even create a waters of the U.S. under the liberal definition of waters of the U.S. So neither one of them have made taken a position on it. Now, at some point, I'm happy to describe it if you like, but Mr. Trump hasn't taken a position. I'm not sure he's aware of it, frankly. I haven't talked to him about it.
Yeah, as I said, Secretary Clinton, I'm not aware that she's commented on it, so I can't freelance.
I'd tell you if she did. She hasn't.
Sir.
Yeah, so my question is for both of you, and it's what role, if any, do you think the federal government can or should play in promoting renewable sources of electricity? And if you think there is a role for the federal government, what do you think is the most effective policy to promote that?
Go ahead. This is a good nerdy one.
Great, thanks for the question. So I'll talk specifically about Secretary Clinton's plan. She set a target of generating 1/3 of our electricity from renewable sources within a decade. We're at about 16% now. A couple of things to do that. The first is implementation of the Clean Power Plan. The separate, as I mentioned, we're already 84% of the way towards those Clean Power Plan targets, and her view is that we've got what it takes as a country to go even farther than that, and so she's called for a Clean Energy Challenge, which will provide competitive grants to states, cities, and rural communities that lead on clean energy, whether it's wind and solar, whether it's advanced nuclear, whether it's carbon capture and sequestration, efficiency, advanced vehicles. She's also, and we were talking about this before, the power system is changing from something where we could generate electricity anywhere we wanted to. We could set a coal or a natural gas plant anywhere we wanted to, and then we just move the fuel to it, to renewable electricity where you need to generate it where the sun is and the wind is, and you need to move the electricity to the market. And so a critical part of accelerating renewable energy deployment is accelerating construction of transmission lines to get low-cost renewable energy to market, which I think is something that the Congressman and I probably agree on. She sees our public lands and waters as playing a critical role in America's clean energy economy, and has set a goal for a 10-fold increase in renewable energy production on public lands and waters, whether that's solar, geothermal in Nevada, wind in Wyoming or North Dakota, offshore wind in Virginia. And I'll make sure there's a whole of government effort around permitting and transmission construction to make that happen. And then there's a lot of federal buildings and federal infrastructure that can be leveraged for clean energy deployment. So we've got existing dams, much of which are in Appalachia, Ohio River Valley, Tennessee Valley, that don't have powerhouses. Right, where we could easily install up to 12 gigawatts of generating capacity on those existing dams. These are run by the Army Corps of Engineers, and you don't have to dam new waters. You're just generating electricity from existing dams. And if we do all those things, then we should be able to get 1/3 of our electricity from renewables within a decade. Shouldn't be that hard. Iowa's already at 1/3 of its electricity from renewable energy, up from 7% a decade ago. It's amazing how fast the technology costs are falling. I mean, solar, just this year, solar costs are down 25%. I think wind costs are down 20%. Solar costs are 90% below where they were in 2008. It's moving really quick.
So great question, and with regard to the federal role, I do want to get to that because it is complicated when you're talking about the movement of electricity. Neurons go where neurons want to go once they're on a line, right? And so Trevor talked about decentralizing, and that certainly is part of it. But when you decentralize and you're generating more electricity than you can consume in a particular area, what do you do with that extra electricity? Who's responsible for it? You have interstate commerce laws, you have engineering challenges. So it's very, and Trevor and I both know this is very complicated, and if you study this, you'll find out it's economics, it's engineering, it's law, it's states' rights versus federal. I think when you're talking about large transmission development, for example, there should be a federal backstop. But this is a very important balance because you don't want to take states' rights away or even locational rights away when it comes to large corridors and routes and whatnot. But at the same time, you are talking about interstate commerce, and one township could stop a whole project that's for the greater good. And so Donald Trump's been he probably doesn't go to that level of discussion, but he's pretty clear that he wants to grow the infrastructure development of this country. In fact, in recent years, there have been at least 12 major infrastructure projects that have been either withdrawn by the federal government, killed by the federal government, or withdrawn by the investors because of regulatory uncertainty, adding up to $33 billion worth of development. So I'm glad to hear Secretary Clinton wants to reverse that. I have an amendment. Now, just to give you a sense of how contentious these issues are in Congress, right now, one of the possible bills that we may pass yet in the lame duck is an energy infrastructure bill. One passed the House, one passed the Senate. There's a conference committee working out the details. And I brought a very simple amendment that probably relates more to where Trevor's from in Wyoming than North Dakota, but that would allow a utility to manage the vegetation within a 150-foot corridor, right away of a transmission line on federal lands. So we're talking about mountains largely, right, with a lot of forests. Realizing, by the way, that this gets to reliability, which is a federal responsibility, the larger reliability issue, and it gets to fire danger and those kinds of things in the mountain west. Now you're getting into other environmental challenges. It's not just electricity, you're talking about timber and those kinds of things. I promised in the legislation it wouldn't cost taxpayers anything, and I promised in the legislation, God forbid the utility nor the federal government would ever sell any of that timber and make money for anybody. That, God forbid, we'd commit that sin. So we didn't allow that even in the legislation. It's that basic. And guess who got up to oppose it on the floor? But the ranking Democrat in the Energy and Commerce Committee, who's from New Jersey. And I said to him, you do realize, right, that the recent blackouts in New Jersey were caused by a tree in Michigan. This is how, again, this is how polarizing we get. You bring something that's as fundamental as vegetation management funded by not the taxpayer but the ratepayer, and that keeps our forest both safe and electricity running. It's a big challenge. But to your fundamental point, I think it's a mixed role. Again, everybody's got to be at the table, but there is a legal role both for the federal government and local and state government.
So I have a question for both of you, which is, we've seen such dramatic changes in the American energy industry over the past decade, huge growth of natural gas, decline of coal. And so the question is, what do we owe coal communities or other communities that have been left behind in this transition?
You want to start with that?
Yeah,
I mean,
sure.
Secretary Clinton has actually a specific plan for that.
Yeah, thanks. So this is an issue that Secretary Clinton cares passionately about. And look, this is, while the war on coal narrative makes a good soundbite in coal country, while it's easy for Donald Trump to show up to a rally and put on a hard hat and promise to return coal employment back to its glory days, we've been transitioning away from coal employment for a long time, right? So coal employment in Central Appalachia peaked at about 200,000 in the 1940s. By the time President Obama took office, we were at 41,000. We're now at 25,000. In Virginia, you guys lost 3 times more coal mining jobs under Reagan than you did under President Obama because of mechanization and movement of coal production to my home state of Wyoming, which had lower sulfur coal. It is difficult, but we owe it to the people who've kept the lights on and the factories running for more than a century to have an honest conversation about what's happening in the market and not offer false promises about being able to recreate a coal economy that we left decades ago. And so Secretary Clinton put together a plan last year for revitalizing coal communities that would lift up and support locally driven economic diversification efforts like the Sustainable Williamson Initiative in southern West Virginia, Reconnecting McDowell, the SOAR Initiative in eastern Kentucky, new investments in infrastructure, repurposing abandoned mine lands, accelerating broadband deployment. The nice thing about the internet is that some of the old geographic barriers to investment in places like Appalachia are easier to overcome now because of broadband, because of the internet. We can all get connected to markets and customers in a more equitable way, and to offset the decline in school funding. And then last May, she spent 2 days in what I'm sure our political team thought was something close to electoral malfeasance. Spent 2 days in eastern Kentucky and southern West Virginia, in parts of the country that are going to vote overwhelmingly for Donald Trump in November, to actually have hard conversations face to face with people about what they're facing and how she, as president, whether they vote for her or not, could be an active partner in helping them build a more diversified economic future. This isn't an easy conversation. It's not an easy conversation in my home state of Wyoming. I mean, we're 45% of US coal production. But it's a conversation I wish we would have had 15 years ago. When I was growing up, North Dakota's kind of new to the oil game. When I was growing up, I was living through the fallout from the last oil price collapse, right? Where some of our counties lost 25% of their population in 2 or 3 years as everybody left the state to find jobs elsewhere. And instead of doing what Colorado did at that point, which was invest in economic diversification, invest in renewable energy and other industries, Wyoming remained a one-trick pony and doubled down on fossil fuel production. Now we're living through the exact same thing again. It's not as bad as I think North Dakota. I think Q1, the North Dakota economy contracted by 12% because of the drop in oil prices. Wyoming's economy is contracting by about 5% right now. Meanwhile, Colorado, which is home to the National Renewable Energy Lab, has 6,000 people employed in wind. It has one of the fastest growing state economies in the country. That's what I want from my home state. That's what I want for Appalachia. These are tough conversations to have, but you start them with an honest conversation about what's actually happening and not just slogans about a war on coal and promises about being able to return us to the 40s.
So if Solyndra is one of your favorite constituencies, it gives you lots of money, then you advocate for policies that subsidize other forms of energy. Mr. Trump wants a technology neutral energy policy that puts American-made energy first, whether it's wind, solar, coal, gas, oil, biomass, ethanol, whatever the case might be, but not the government picking the winners and picking the losers. They just wanted to pick the winners. Specifically with regard to coal, I don't know about you, but my dad was a rural electric lineman. He wouldn't have found a lot of comfort in the, guess what, we're going to put you out of a job, but don't worry, the government will come back. We're going to wire your home up for the internet, and you'll be just fine. We'll teach you how to program or something. This is the type of management that liberals love to utilize. They love to manipulate because of their political agenda rather than a neutral market-based solution. Coal, I mean, Virginia is a classic example. You've lost, as I said, 70% of your coal jobs. By the way, in the last few decades, coal jobs were going up until 2011. Yes, down prior to that when they went with mechanization and stuff, but since then, they've been going up until 2011. A recent Duke University study concluded that 9% of the coal-fired power plants were vulnerable to low gas prices. It also concluded that 56% of coal-fired plants were susceptible or vulnerable to EPA regulations. The government should not be determining who gets a job and who gets a government program. They ought to be out of the business of determining those things and let the market decide, and then help the industries. By the way, Mr. Trump's talked about a technology-neutral R&D, where R&D could go into clean coal technologies, how to do fracking better if it's necessary, as well as solar, wind. But again, not picking the winners and losers, but letting the market pick the fuel source.
All right, I think we have time for one or two more questions from the audience.
Looks like two.
Two, we'll take two.
Thank you both for being here this afternoon. So both of you have talked about the tremendous reduction in NOx and SOx, the nitrous oxides and the sulfur oxides, but from a very different perspective. So that great reduction, there was a federal program behind that. Was that federal program hindering, neutral, or was it that federal program that enabled the kinds of business innovations to create that great reduction?
Sure. Do you want to go first? Or?
Yeah, sure. I mean, look, I think we have a proud, since the EPA was put in place in 1970, we've reduced air pollution by 70% and we've tripled the size of the economy. We have a proud tradition of putting in place common sense environmental protections with rigorous cost-benefit analysis that are reflective of technologies in the market and address the pollutant without hindering economic activity. And that is a tradition that Republicans have helped build, and I think it's unfortunate that Republicans are now either running from or attacking that tradition of common sense environmental protection, or somehow think that it's not applicable to carbon pollution, which is one of the most challenging pollutants that we face right now. If we could do it for SOx, if we could do it for lead in gasoline, lead wouldn't have just come out of gasoline without environmental policy to remove it from gasoline, and the benefit that's had on human health in this country is dramatic. Safety regulations, right? There is an appropriate role for government in addressing an environmental risk or a public health risk that that company itself doesn't have an interest in addressing. The carbon I emit from a coal-fired power plant is not impacting me. It's impacting everybody else. So as a company, I have no interest in addressing it myself, right? That's where environmental policy comes into place, is to ensure that the broader public good is reflected in the business environment that individual companies operate under. And I think that we have an obligation to apply that same strategy, that same framework to addressing global climate change, and I think that we can do it cost effectively.
Great question, and a pretty good answer all in all. However, I'm going to go back to SOX, NOx, first of all, would any industry just voluntarily do it without any oversight or encouragement by the government? Probably not. The incentive is for profit, right? That said, in those situations, and in every situation up to this Clean Power Plan, again, the technological advancements and solutions were developed by the innovators in the industry themselves. Yes, with some encouragement in law, yes, with some regulatory push, and yes, with state governments were involved as well as the federal government, and the innovators were at the table. That is what's missing in this situation. I appreciated Trevor said with a serious cost-benefit analysis. That's another thing that's been missing in the last many years, including waters of the U.S. There's a little law in regulatory law called the RFA, the Regulatory Flexibility Act. It is a requirement for any administrative agency before implementing a rule to do a serious cost-benefit analysis, to include, in the case of some things, the Small Business Administration and other agencies. They don't even include the Department of Energy in their environmental regulations. They didn't even include the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission in the Clean Power Plan until it was sort of forced on them at the very end, and then they did a little bit of technological review by the FERC to consider not just economics, but the reliability impacts of the Clean Power Plan. So that's what's been different about this one. It's been the approach by this president to go it alone, to go it unilaterally, and to just sort of force things on people and on industry. And that's why, frankly, that's why we have such a low workforce participation rate. Again, saying, hey, we're going to give you a government program, coal miners, don't worry about us killing your jobs. That's irresponsible, it's insensitive, and it's frankly really bad public policy.
Yes, sir. I think you had the last question.
He was hoping we'd talk so long he didn't have to ask it.
Well, thank you both for being here. This has been wonderful to be actually talking about policy, and I might write you guys in instead of.
I'm with you on that. Yeah.
So it's clear that the majority of our energy infrastructure was built in the 20th century. So as we look towards the future, and with all of the technology that's out there, and the technology that we don't even know about, what's a 21st century energy infrastructure look like to you, and how do we pay for it?
Yeah. Thanks for the last part of that question, because that's a pretty big part of the challenge, isn't it? So we have a couple of problems, right? We've talked a lot about gas as the bridge fuel, the transition to a more renewable fuel electric generation, but we also know, probably in this area, I don't know, but certainly not far from here, there have been a lot of, not in my backyard, protests for gas pipelines. I think as a country we need to have a better discussion about it. One thing about politics, and our two candidates are as much a reflection of this as I am as a member of Congress, and as the members from other districts, 435 of us in the House, are a perfect reflection, frankly, of the American public. And so I think in many respects we need to have this kind of a policy discussion with the general public more often. So I really applaud the University of Richmond and the law school here specifically for this and for what you're doing. But so there's that. How we pay for it is going to be a very big challenge. Who pays for infrastructure, energy infrastructure, are ratepayers. That's who pays for it. That's why a robust cost-benefit analysis is so important. People say we haven't had an energy policy in this country for a long time. The reality is we've had one forever. It's called low cost. That's the energy policy that I regulated under as a public service commissioner. Low cost with some federal oversight on certain things like environmental protection, with things like transmission reliability and siting. But that's gotten so difficult because so many local politics have also made that difficult. So I just think it's a matter of discussion. Ratepayers will pay for it ultimately, but we can't forget that. What it looks like, it's going to look like more gas lines. It's going to look like more electric transmission lines, hopefully with a clear path through the mountains where they're safe, where the forests are safe, and then probably a lot more decentralized generation, especially in the nuclear side as well as the renewable side.
Great question. It's a big one. Let me focus just on the electric power side of it, which I think there's really some exciting developments happening right now, and that are going to remake the way we think about electricity infrastructure. So, like I said before, we're not just moving in a different direction in terms of the type of generation, going from something that was dispatchable and could be sited anywhere like a coal-fired power plant or a gas-fired power plant, to renewable electricity, which is more location dependent, whether it's utility scale, large wind farms, large solar farms, or whether it's distributed. But it needs to be in a certain place where the wind and sun is, and the transmission investment required to get that to market. But we also have some really exciting things happening on the customer side of the meter right now, and rooftop solar is just the tip of that. Battery storage, electric vehicle charging infrastructure, and so we're going from a grid that was built around large central station power plant delivering electricity in one direction to customers who just pay a fixed rate and don't really pay much attention to how much they pay, to customers being power generators themselves, bidding in electricity into the market, whether it's panels on their roof or a battery system if you're a commercial or industrial customer, and really interacting with the grid. That requires a huge amount of investment in infrastructure, but it's ultimately going to be incredibly cost saving to give households more control over the type of electricity they buy, the more control over the kind of electricity they can actually produce and how they participate in that system.
Let me tell you one of the regulatory challenges with that, and that is, oftentimes when we talk about these kinds of things, including things like energy efficiency as an example, what happens is the lowest earning people, the people with the least financial resources, often are the ones that get hurt the most, because they can't afford the rooftop solar panel or the wind generation, or to bid into the market, or frankly even to insulate their homes in many cases. And so what happens is that they end up subsidizing those who can afford the things that pay out in 10, 20, 30, 40 years, and they're not able to make that initial investment. So this socializing, this is why regulatory law is so fascinating, and why utility, especially administrative law, is so fascinating, because you have to be economist, you have to be engineer, you have to be a policy nerd, and you kind of have to look out for the folks. And we did an interesting thing Trevor's familiar with in North Dakota. When I was on the commission, we did the very first decoupling of natural gas rates, where we took, and it was risky politically, at least people thought it was. I was too new to know that. So I led the charge and said, this makes perfect sense to me. Let's triple the meter charge of the gas, the gas customer, and then reduce the gas cost per decatherm. And of course, that creates an incentive. North Dakota's a cold place, so you're still 85% of your bill. We need to be honest, right? 85% of your bill is still the gas itself. So you still have an incentive to not burn that much, keep your thermostat low, and those natural efficiency things. But you remove the incentive of the company to sell more gas, because their profit didn't come from the volumes of gas sold. That's a market solution. It's pretty basic. And the only people that complained about it, by the way, were people who had gas-fired fireplaces or gas-heated swimming pools. Because what do you mean? I only run that thing a couple times a year. I only heat my pool 2 months out of the year. I don't need this charge every month. Well, the reality was the people with the drafty homes were subsidizing the guy's swimming pool. And so you always have to look out for the whole of the utility, the whole of the utility customer in a lot of this stuff. But this is the fun stuff you guys can work on when you're getting into the nerdy issues.
Trevor, I'll give you the last word. Is there anything you want to say in response?
No, I wish decoupling would have come up as a topic in the presidential debate. That would have been great. That is an alternative future that we all wish. She
finally took that sheet out and used it.
Look, I think the good news is the cost of this stuff is falling so fast, faster than anybody expected. We're signing wind and solar PPAs at 3-4 cents per kilowatt hour now, and there's a lot more cost compression to come. And the amount of innovation that's occurring in this space right now, people thinking about not just new technologies, but new business models and how to integrate those technologies into the grid. The electric power industry, which I think is safe to say has been a sector devoid of kind of innovation and creative thinking for a long time, is going through a really exciting tectonic change. So it's any of those of you who want to go be electricity sector attorneys or utility commissioners, I think it's going to be a pretty exciting time to do so.
Just don't come to Congress and ask for another extension of the production tax credit so the taxpayers can subsidize all this cheap electricity.
Well, listen, there's a few people I want to thank before we close. Emily Cherry and Chris Henderson and our whole Environmental Law Society here at the law school. Great job in putting this together.
Yeah, good job.
So we have a reception which is out in the atrium, which you're all welcome to attend. And I want to thank our two speakers, Congressman Cramer, Trevor Houser. Thanks for your time and for the information.
Thank you. Great. Thank you.